Thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight for the US and China past, present, and future, conflict and cooperation. We have two amazing speakers tonight, Mark Selden and Zhiqun. And we are just going to kind of discuss a little bit about modern Chinese history, US-China foreign relations, and go into a bit of a discussion and a Q&A at the end of this. So welcome. And I just want to thank Massachusetts Peace Action, the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, as well as the Committee for a Sane US-China Policy for sponsoring this webinar. And I'll just let a couple other people log on. But just to give a little bit of a brief overview, I'm just going to kind of give you what we're going to be talking about tonight. And so for the first 20 minutes, we're going to have an overview of modern Chinese history from Mark Selden. And then after that, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, 20 minutes from Zhiqun about US-China relations. And then we'll have a discussion between the two of them and me. And then please continue to ask questions in the chat box, and we will get those answered to the best of our abilities at the end of the webinar. But I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction for both of these professors, and they can both add on themselves when they speak in a couple of minutes. And again, welcome everyone for coming. So with us, we have Mark Selden, and Mark Selden is a senior research associate in the East Asia program at Cornell University and a professor of sociology and history at the State University of New York in Binghamton. He's also the editor of the Asia Pacific Journal, Japan Focus, and his research encompasses the modern and contemporary geopolitics, political economy, and history of China, Japan, and the Asia Pacific. And today he will be giving us a brief overview of modern Chinese history, discussing China's revolutionary changes, imperialist movements throughout a roughly 5,000-year history, I think, give or take. And then Zhiqun is a professor of political science and international relations at Bucknell University. He is a noted scholar on Chinese foreign policy and a member of the National Committee on US-China Relations, as well as an author and editor of a dozen books. And he's received a number of research fellowships and grants, including a Fulbright to Australia, to POSCO fellowships at the East-West Center in Hawaii, a Korea Foundation and Freeman Foundation grant to do research in Korea, and these are just to name several. And today, as I said before, following Mark's historical overview of China, Dr. Zhu will be discussing US-China relations from the 18th century to 20th century, including immigration, the Continental Railroad, Chinese Exclusion Act, and kind of how this relationship has continued to shift since then. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. Sit tight, and Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Drew, and hello, everyone. Actually, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you're not going to get the full 5,000 years today. We're going to look a little bit closer down to home. And I'm also going to extend a bit what I'm talking about to address China's revolutionary transformations and to say a few things about how that relates to the future of US-China relations. Perhaps no two nations have seen a comparable roller coaster in their relationship throughout the long 20th century like that of the United States and China. Certainly none have been more consequential in shaping global military conflict or affecting such dramatic shifts in interstate, regional, and global relations. I'd like to reflect briefly on contemporary changes in US-China relations in light of the tumultuous historical changes in China's position since the 17th century. These changes in China's regional and global position include 4 points that I want to emphasize. First, the vast territorial expansion of the Chinese Empire. Mongolia, among other areas, redefining the political and social dynamics not only of China, but of East Asia as well, and of China and of various nationalities on its borders. Second, the collapse of the Qing dynasty and invasions by successive imperialist powers, including Portugal, Britain, France, Germany, and yes, let's not forget the United States and Japan in the late 19th and early 20th century, resulting in perpetual civil and international wars, turning China upside down, in other words. Third, this turmoil gave rise to nationalist revolutions. The Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, ruled China for a period of time in the 20s and 30s, but ultimately in the civil wars and the global wars that tore China apart in the 30s and 40s, ultimately culminating in a communist-led liberation movement that touched off and inspired anti-colonial and socialist movements worldwide. I want to emphasize the role of China as the critical nation in leading the way in liberation movements, anti-colonial liberation movements in the 20th century, influencing many, many other countries, but of course going in its own direction ultimately. And fourth, the victory of a Chinese revolution, initially inspired by the Russian Revolution, before pioneering its own course under Mao, and subsequently a very different course in many ways under his successors, now Xi Jinping in the chair, with a life term behind his back. Well, the point I'm making is that China was central to the far-reaching revolutionary changes in the world system over recent centuries. In short, the US and China, as well as the Soviet Union, decisively stamped the revolutionary changes, including the global socialist and capitalist transformations of the long 20th century, each in distinctive ways and in relationship to one another. Against the background of these cataclysmic changes in China and the Asia Pacific, I propose to reflect particularly on the changing course of China-US relations in ways that call into question current American representations of the US as the epitome of democracy and China exclusively as a dictatorial menace to the US and the world, by recalling both periods of warm US-China relations, as well as the rocky relations that characterize a number of other periods as well. The point is that we have an open historical situation, one that is filled with recent changes and one that is capable of many future changes. And the tendencies to see this as a closed book at the present time is one of the great dangers that we face in the US-China relationship, and I would say on a world scale. It's worth recalling that the US, in the wake of its experience in displacing Native Americans and creating a slave society, was an imperialist power in the thick of the opium trade in China, in seizing a vast range of guano islands in the Pacific in the late 19th century, before securing its own major colony in the Philippines, while joining with the imperialist powers in imposing the treaty port regimes in China, when no single power was able to control China's vast territory. When Japan attempted to do just that, that is to take it all, the US after Pearl Harbor aligned with Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang against Japan and against the Communist Party at that time, eventually supporting Chiang Kai-shek's move to Taiwan and thus intervening to prevent consummation of the revolution led by the Communist Party following the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang on the mainland. From the 1940s to the 1960s, the US repeatedly fought Chinese communists in the final years of the Civil War. Then in Korea, ending in stalemate, and then in Vietnam, in a war that deeply divided American society and ended in a thunderous United States defeat that coincided with years of revolutionary change in China. And of course, both the Chinese and the Korean War involved China on the other side from the US, supporting North Korea and supporting the Vietnamese led by Ho Chi Minh. All this preceded the great turn in US-China relations of 1970 that I wrote about first half a century ago in Open Secret, the Nixon-Kissinger Doctrine in Asia. The great US-China opening or détente of that era had three principal components. The first was a US-China geostrategic entente, leading to mutual recognition and directed against the Soviet Union the major global challenger to US hegemony in the decades following World War II. And by the 1960s, also viewed by the Chinese leadership as the main revisionist threat, the Chinese preeminence within the world revolution. In other words, China and the Russians, China and the Soviets, who had been close allies in the 1950s, by this time were at each other's throats. The second, with the threat to the US dollar as a result, excuse me, from a tacit US-China military entente, oh, we said that, okay. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia followed the massive, sorry, my computer is doing strange things to my text. Let's see if this does any better. Can't get it smaller. Okay. From a tacit US-China military entente directed against the Soviet Union and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia followed the massive economic and other bonds between the US and the Chinese economy that veered towards state capitalism from the late Mao years and after, while strengthening financial bonds with the US, as in its purchase of more than $1 trillion in US bonds. One result of deepening US-China ties was a flood of Chinese students to American universities, students and researchers, 1/3 of the total foreign student population by the time that COVID struck, with increasing numbers of universities becoming financially dependent on Chinese tuition. By this time, 150 million Chinese tourists each year were traveling abroad and spending lavishly as China was integrated with the US and world economies. So we get a fundamental shift of China's position in the world, one that was supported by the United States at a time when US and China had their eye on a Soviet enemy as a major threat. Suddenly, in the Trump and Biden administrations, every one of these elements of US-China integration would be demonized as a direct threat to American global power, our technological leadership, and ultimately the welfare of the American people. Each of these considerations now factor as background in our attempt to grasp the US and China relationship today. But I would like to focus on their implications for the dangers of war, specifically nuclear war, as well as ecocidal Armageddon in the era of climate crisis. Specifically, I want to reflect on the possible alternatives to the present deep conflict between China and the US if we were to revert once again to proactive relationships and the easing of global tensions that are in the interests of both peoples, I would argue. The US and China are the two largest economies in the world, as well as by far the leading producers of greenhouse gases. US commentators are fond of pointing out that China is the largest polluter, which it is. But of course, the fact is that the US produces vastly greater quantities of greenhouse gas per capita, as well as historically its production of greenhouse gases. That is, in total production of greenhouse gases over time. It should be obvious that cooperative US-China relationships are critical if the world is to avoid the consequences of ecological disaster posed by global warming and catastrophic economic and social and financial setbacks, as well as nuclear holocaust. If the present march toward conflict between the two most powerful nations in the world continues. It's worth underlining the fact that China is surrounded by a ring of US military bases in Japan, Okinawa, South Korea, and Guam, among others, and with repeated conflicts throughout the China Sea, where China has made and seeks to enforce large territorial claims, while the US, thousands of miles away, faces no comparable threats on its borders. The central point here is this: so long as the US continues to demonize China across the board as a military, economic, technological, environmental threat, there's scant prospect for effective global approaches to resolve any of these issues, least of all climate crisis or military tensions between the two superpowers. The military threat was underlined in recent weeks with notable clarity in two ways. One brilliantly analyzed by Professor Zhu in his analysis of the US-China clash over Taiwan and its potential to lead the war. I'd be surprised if we didn't hear a bit more about that shortly. The other was the open publication of the US Army's August 2021 250-page text on Chinese military tactics. The Army's analysis, of course, builds on innumerable classified studies that we're not privy to on Chinese and US military strategies, tactics, and capacities. And indeed, the report notes the difficulty of providing a compelling analysis of Chinese tactics in the event of war with the US. Not least, it rightly observes that with a few exceptions, such as border clashes with India and its unsuccessful campaign against Vietnam, the Chinese have fought no major war in the last 6 decades since the US-Korean War, which ended in stalemate in 1953, and the Vietnam War, which followed that. This is particularly worth pondering in light of the US forever wars that presently preoccupy Americans and others, including the US-Vietnam War, the US-Cambodia War, the US-Iraq War, and US direct and indirect involvement in wars in Syria, Libya, and many others in recent decades. So this is the context of the present situation in which the United States and China now are in a period of deep conflict. The US debacle in Afghanistan brings us back to the US-China clash in numerous ways. First and most directly is the fact that numerous military and journalistic commentators underline the fact that coming to closure in Afghanistan after 20 abortive years allows the US military to focus on its real challenge, overcoming the Chinese threat. One striking fact about US reporting on the Afghan crisis offers a powerful commentary on our forever wars, and indeed any future war with China. This is the endless hand-wringing over the fact that confronting an August 31st deadline for withdrawal of US forces, some American citizens and tens of thousands of Afghans who served the US war effort as it sought to crush the Afghan resistance may be unable to evacuate. What was missing, above all, is the total absence of concern about the millions of Afghans dislocated by the US war effort and the many seeking to flee the Taliban regime, or even recognition of the enormous toll imposed by the US on the people it claimed to be rescuing in Afghanistan. As Richard Falk perceptively put it, quote, "What the prolonged intervention leaves behind is an impoverished country of nearly 40 million with virtually no capacity to sustain itself without massive outside economic assistance. Given this reality, after 20 years of occupation and supposed guardianship, the most fundamental failure of the American post-9/11 operation was its utter inability to improve living standards and help Afghanistan gain some measure of self-sufficiency and self-governing capability," end quote. The Army report correctly underlines the fact that the Biden administration has embraced and even intensified the Trump administration's targeting of China as an implacable enemy and threat to American hegemony. The point is that, underlined by the unanimity across political lines, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, extending to the major media and academia with scant public dissent on the demonization of China. The shift in the US stance is particularly remarkable in light of the post-1970 half-century change in US priority in relations with China. Since the 1970s facilitated China's rise as a global power. This is not to suggest an absence of US-China conflicts in recent years, sparked by new Chinese policies. These include, but are not limited to, China's challenging claim to exclusive territorial fishing and mining rights throughout the South China Sea and backing those claims with military force. China's rapid increase in coal-based production of greenhouse gases in recent years, even as it announces plans to replace coal with renewables by 2030, and a host of Chinese domestic issues, including repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, conflict with Hong Kong, and the repression of human rights activists there and elsewhere. The point is simply that the US assault on China on all fronts since the Trump era has made it impossible to negotiate seriously on significant issues at stake in conflict between the two countries. Both China and the United States have changed in pronounced ways over recent decades, during which China experienced the world's most rapid economic growth, while the US and Chinese economy became closely intertwined. Against this background, the fundamental shift in US policies toward China is startling. Above all, the apparent unanimity in the US attacks on China on multiple fronts, raising the specter both of dislocation in the economy and society, and ultimately of war between the two most powerful nations in the world.
Thank you, Mark. Do you have anything else to add to that, or shall I pass the floor on?
I'm going to have to stop here as my my computer is giving me impossible difficulties. I have some other things that I may add later about the current clash and the consequences of it, but I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Beautiful. Sounds good. We can talk about that a little bit after Zhiqun's able to go and talk a little bit more about US-China relations. And so that is the next section of this webinar. The floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Drew. Thank you, Professor Selden. That's a wide-ranging survey of China's recent history and its rise and its challenge to the United States and international system. I think you cover a lot of topics. Perhaps we can come back and revisit some of the issues you covered. Let me use my 20 minutes to talk about the history of US-China relations. I think we can divide the history of US-China relations into three broad periods. The first period is from the 1780s to the end of the 19th century. The second period covers the 20th century, and third period covers the 21st century. Let me briefly highlight some major events and recurring themes in each period to see how the two countries gradually become so interdependent. Now, the first period, late 18th century to the end of the 19th century. This period began with the first US commercial ship, Empress of China, traveling from New York to Canton in 1784, and ended with the Boxer Rebellion and America's open door policy towards China. Some of the recurring themes during this period include trade, educational and cultural exchanges, Chinese immigration to the United States, and American missionaries in China. We all know that opium was part of the trade between China and the United States. And many Americans actually benefited from this trade with China. As an example, Warren Delano the grandfather of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, made a huge fortune smuggling illegal opium into China. Now, gold rush on the West Coast, 1848, attracted many Chinese to the United States. Many stayed, and many more came in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. Now, these Chinese laborers, called coolies, built the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. In 1868, the two countries signed a treaty called Baldwin Treaty. Baldwin was Abraham Lincoln's envoy to China, Anson Baldwin. Very interesting. You know, he and China negotiated a deal and encouraged Chinese immigration to the United States and gave the so-called most favored nation status to China in trade. And later, he became involved in the Chinese government. He became a Chinese envoy to the United States. So this is very rare in his diplomatic history. Now, in the mid-1870s, a series of economic crises here in the United States saw banks fail, stock market crash, businesses close, and labor demands dry up. So American political winds were beginning to shift in the years leading up to the notorious 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. We all know that this act banned immigration from China and prohibited those Chinese already in the United States from applying for citizenship. This is the first racist legislation against an entire ethnic group in American history. 1854, young man named Yang Wing became the first Chinese student to graduate from an American university, Yale College. Yang Wing helped organize the first group of Chinese students to study in the United States, the so-called Chinese Education Mission that started in 1872. The Qing dynasty sent about 120 boys aged between 10 and 15 and sent them to the United States. The idea was that they're going to spend 15 years here to learn the skills and technology and sciences and then bring them back to China. But this mission unfortunately terminated in 1881, and the students were recalled to China. So this was the first wave of Chinese students arriving in the United States. As Mark Selden mentioned earlier, now the Chinese students account for over 1/3 of all international students in the United States. Now, missionaries also played an important role in promoting cultural and educational exchanges between the two sides. Significantly, over 60% of American missionaries in China were women. Now, these women missionaries helped educate Chinese children and served as role models for Chinese girls. These missionary women also helped women's liberation movement in the United States. For example, some missionary women worked as surgeons in China while being denied the right to enter the operating room in America. Many missionaries also became social activists in the United States. Now, let's quickly move to the second period, the 20th century. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. In 1912, the Republic of China, the first republic in Asia, was founded. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was the founding father, and he was famous for the so-called three principles of the people: the principle of nationalism, principle of democracy, and principle of people's livelihood. And you can tell these principles are heavily influenced by Abraham Lincoln's speech in Gettysburg, in Pennsylvania. If you remember, Lincoln said, "The government of the people, by the people, for the people." I think Dr. Sun's three principles of people are exactly the same as those from Lincoln. Now, in the 20th century, of course, China continued to suffer from the so-called century of humiliation. with Western powers and Japan dominating and occupying China. All these Western powers, of course, are evil, but I think some historians would point out that the United States was probably the least evil imperial power. Why? Well, largely because the United States did not have territorial ambitions in China, did not occupy or colonize China. And also this open door policy, of course, it was benefiting the United States out of US own national interests, but also benefited China, which kept China's territorial integrity and Chinese administrative integrity also intact. Now, in China, there was this so-called new cultural movement in 1910s, 1920s. The Chinese intellectuals were trying to learn from the West and introduce the so-called Mr. S and Mr. D into China. Mr. S, of course, refers to science, technology. Mr. D refers to democracy. So American democracy, freedom, and scientific advancement have really inspired generations of Chinese. Now, quickly moving ahead, Pearl Harbor, 1941, the United States became officially involved in World War II, and the United States joined China, the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek government, as allies against Japan. Just earlier this month, both China and Taiwan actually celebrated 80 years anniversary of flying tigers. Now, very few people in the United States actually heard of flying tigers, especially young people. Well, basically these were American volunteer groups who joined Chinese Air Force and flew hundreds of missions to help the Chinese to combat the Japanese during World War II. So flying tigers today is still a household story in China. I hope that more people in America would learn about how China and the United States were allies, during that period. Now, right after World War II, of course, Chinese Civil War resumed. Chiang Kai-shek was defeated by Mao Zedong's communist forces and retreated to Taiwan. The PRC was founded in 1949. Shortly afterwards, of course, the United States and China were engaged in direct military conflict in the Korean War. The United States and PRC had a difficult time during that period. By the way, the Korean War, of course, has not officially ended since they only signed an armistice in 1953. Now, the frosty relationship between the PRC and the United States came to a close in 1971 when Henry Kissinger made a secret trip to China. He was pretending ill on his trip to Pakistan, and then he was seen by these journalists as being taken to the hospital, but actually he secretly went to the airport and flew to China. His visit, of course, paved the way for President Nixon's visit the following February. And it took a few more years for the two countries to normalize relations. The two sides established diplomatic relations in 1979. From 1979 to 1989, the United States and China experienced a period, some people call it honeymoon period. The relationship was very strong, so good that the United States even sold weapons to China. Can't imagine today, huh? Also, public opinion of China in the United States was dominantly positive. 1989, right before Tiananmen Square, 72% of Americans held positive views of China. Today, only 20% of Americans view China favorably. And of course, throughout all this area, the Taiwan was the key issue, still is today. Right? Into the 1990s, the two countries argued over many issues, such as human rights, as a result of Tiananmen Square, right? Trade, China gradually its economy is taking off, right? A lot of issues involving trade came up, and of course Taiwan, right? And in 1999, the United States, through its NATO mission, U.S. missiles bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, causing a crisis in the relationship. But eventually, towards the end of the 20th century, United States decided to support China's entry into the WTO. Now, let me briefly, quickly move to the third period, 21st century. Now, we all know that the relationship experienced many ups and downs in history. It is obviously at a very low point now. So what is wrong with the relationship today? To borrow a line from Dorothy in the classic movie, The Wizard of Oz, she told her dog, Toto, we are not in Kansas anymore. The United States and China relationship has fundamentally changed, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Now, quantitatively, when Deng Xiaoping opened China up in the late 1970s, China's per capita GDP was lower than most African and Latin American countries. In the 2000s, China's economy leapfrogged, overtaking European countries, right, one by one, right? Italy, France, Britain, and Germany. 2012, it surpassed Japan as the second largest economy. Today, if you look at the absolute GDP size, China's is over 70% the size of US economy. And of course, according to some economists, based on the purchasing power parity, PPP, China's economy is already larger than the US economy. No matter how you look at it, I think it's just a matter of time that the China's economy will be larger than the US economy. And China is today the largest trading partner of over 120 countries, including all major economies and all US allies, basically. Now, qualitatively, it's more complicated. You can check some of the books about why the United States and China decided to normalize relations in late 60s, early 70s, at the peak of the Cold War. I mean, a major reason was that they faced this common threat from the Soviet Union, right? But the problem is, when the Cold War was over, the Soviet threat was gone. The foundation of US-China relationship disappeared. I think even today, they're still trying to find out what will be a new basis for their cooperation. And without the foundation, they're going to have a lot of problems between them. And of course, after decades of reforms, China has achieved much progress economically, socially, and also politically to some extent, right? But it remains an authoritarian regime, leading to the claim by some US officials that the engagement policy of the United States in the past 40 years has failed. And the Biden administration has defined the competition between the two countries as between democracy and autocracy. Of course, we all know that the competition is not just about the political system. We are really entering a period of intense competition, economically, diplomatically, technologically, militarily, and ideologically. Some worry that a new Cold War is upon us, and the situation is not very promising. That's why I think, the grassroots groups, such as the sponsors of today's event, the Massachusetts Peace Action, the Committee for a Sane US-China Policy, and the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, are doing a remarkable job in raising the awareness of the danger in the current US-China relationship. I think we should all work together to avoid war and promote peace. I will stop here for the time being. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both Zhiqun and Mark, for speaking today. I appreciate both of you being able to come on here and talk a little bit more about how modern Chinese history and US-Chinese relations do directly inform the political climate that we have now, and that in general, as American citizens, as a young person, we don't often know as much about Chinese history and how it relates to America's own history. So thank you, both of you, for providing such a great overview for all of us. And I just wanted to open the floor for us three to have a little bit of a discussion about what we just talked about. And if both of you have questions for each other, feel free to ask those. But I just wanted to start pretty broadly with, after both of your considerations about Chinese history and kind of the history of US-Chinese relations, I know there's some debate within the academic world of exactly when the deterioration of US and Chinese relations began. Do either of you feel like you have maybe a year or a specific instance in which you think that this might have been how relations began to deteriorate and where to go from there?
Mark, you want to go first?
You first.
I don't know whether there's a specific year from as a starting point when the relationship began to deteriorate. I think it's a process. It really started from the mid 2000s, early 2010s, after, as I mentioned, after Chinese economy quickly moved up, become the second largest by 2012. So in the United States and other economies, other countries, it's natural that they feel threatened by this new giant economy, especially a country that is not a democracy. So they feel like China does not belong to this club. So anxiety, fear, mixed feelings towards China. On the other hand, of course, as China became more powerful, both the Chinese government and Chinese public became very confident. And the policies, especially foreign policies out of China, are viewed as assertive, even aggressive. So the two sides gradually really departed from each other. Initially, in the 80s and 90s, they were still together, working together on a lot of issues. And China was relatively weak, and the United States didn't have to feel worried about being challenged. But now it has become real that the United States perhaps cannot stay at the top for long, especially by a challenger that does not necessarily share many of the values the United States has. So, long story short, I think it's a process, and it has been going on for about 10, 15 years now.
I think that's true, but perhaps the most important element of this is the Trump administration, and perhaps even more important, the following on of the Trump basic policies by the Biden administration afterwards. Is particularly striking given the fact that the Democrats and Republicans are differing on almost everything, both in domestic policies and even in international policies. But the Trump approach has gained enormous power, and we see it in the appointments that Biden has made. We see it in the visits to recently to Vietnam, to Singapore, and elsewhere by the vice president, and visits to the region by the Secretary of Defense, and so on. And what's clear, I think, going back to one of the major points that Professor Zhu has made before, is that we're into a period in which it's perfectly clear that China now is a direct competitor with the United States across the board, including military, including economic, including technological, including trade, including its relationships with other countries. Now, I think it's a mistake to exaggerate that. The United States remains the hegemonic power, but it's a troubled hegemonic power. And the heart of that problem, as I see it, is the forever wars that we're particularly cognizant of at the present time in the wake of the US massive and unexpectedly rapid and total defeat in Afghanistan. And that is particularly important for our subject tonight because coming right out of the box on that, and one of the things I had wanted to talk about earlier is the ways in which the Afghan debacle has raised the voices of particularly Trump people, but also Biden's own people, which says, okay, now nothing so important about Afghanistan. China is the real deal. Now we have to turn our attention to China. And the US military is the heart of this. The issue of Taiwan being the single most explosive one at the moment. But we've had a series of conflicts over Chinese policies in the South China Sea, over clashes between the United States, over something as insignificant as the Diaoyutai Islands, the Senkaku Islands in Japanese rendering that Japan controls, were turned back to Japan after the United States transferred Okinawa back to Japan. So these are the conflicts, both in terms of challenging to the United States economic financial supremacy and a military challenge, even as the United States is the single global superpower.
Can I add a point here?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with Mark. Yes, Trump really was a major cause of the conflict, in the relationship in the past couple of years. But I would not, just give all the blame on Trump. I think, really both parties, both, Republican and the Democratic government administrations are essentially responsible for the deterioration of the relationship. I think, you can go, this goes back to Obama, basically, actually. I mean, it was under Obama administration that the United States developed this policy called pivot. Basically, you're talking about shifting the focus of U.S. overseas deployment of troops from Middle East and Europe, move them to the Asia Pacific. Why? Well, to counter China. So President Obama already started this process. Now into the Biden administration, I think a lot of people had hoped that President Biden would do something different and reverse some of the simply wrong policies initiated by Trump. But so far, I think perhaps we're all disappointed. And especially since Biden and Xi Jinping actually know each other pretty well. They only talk to each other once, and of course Biden is very busy now, of course. But look at the policy, look at the strategies Biden has adopted so far. People in China, I tell you now, I heard from China that colleagues in China that Biden's policies are even, more dangerous, more difficult to handle from the Chinese perspective, because Trump basically was a lunatic, basically a businessman, right? He just wants money, right? He just wants China's money. Now people in China are saying that the Biden administration wants China's life. 要钱还是要命? They want China's life. And Biden is not just, taking a confrontation approach. He's rallying support from US allies and friends to form a united front against China. So that's a different approach from Trump, even more, even riskier, if you like. So I just want to add this, I don't want to, blame everything on Trump. Of course, Trump is largely responsible, but I think both Republican and Democratic administrations are responsible for the problem.
Well, I completely agree with that point, including the origins of the policies in Barack Obama administration. My point simply is that this moves full square ahead under Trump, and then goes further under Biden, and that's where we are at the present time. The point is not that China is not to blame for any of the conflicts between the US and China at this point. There are many issues that need to be resolved between all countries in China and all countries in the United States. But because the United States position is now so in your face on all issues with China, it becomes extremely difficult to talk at this point. And we're at a time when many of those who were in a position to mediate this kind of thing, like large numbers of students and researchers in the States and cooperation technologically and otherwise, those things are off the books at the present time, making it all the more difficult to find the space within which we can deal with the conflicts that divide our two countries at this time.
Yes, I agree with what both of you have said, and thank you for sharing that. And it kind of leaves me with one additional question, and that is, do you think there is a world that can exist, considering that it is very likely, if not guaranteed, that China will surpass US in its economic abilities relatively soon? Do you think that there is a world in which the US will allow that to happen? And what would that look like, and how would that manifest?
Well, I guess I should go first this time. You kindly did the other one. First of all, the measure that you've used for judging the two is one that's often used these days, and that is total GDP, whether we do it with PPP or whether we do it with GNP measures. We shouldn't forget the fact that while total productivity is a measure of interest and importance, that in many ways the much more important one in the long run is the historic measures of per capita GDP. The United States remains a much wealthier nation, much more developed in many kinds of ways, even as we see China gaining rapidly and capable of overcoming the US lead in the measures we've just been talking about. Nevertheless, this clearly is an issue of great concern to American leaders. And the question is, what is to be done about it? One would think that the most important things to be done about it were to get our act together again. We've been critical of Biden as in terms of placing the China issue along the same lines as Trump and going further. But if we look at other kinds of issues, such as the attempt to rebuild the American infrastructure, such as the attempts to develop a healthcare and welfare system in the United States, and a range of issues of this kind, all of which were in sharp retreat or ignored under the Trump administration. We see the possibilities of reversing some of the decline of American power in world perspective. Whether in fact the most fundamental kinds of changes, as I see it, which for example includes the shift in the world manufacturing center from the United States to China in preceding decades, one which was welcomed by Wall Street and welcomed by the US government. Your electronics industry, computers, smartphones, and so on are very good examples of this, all being produced and or assembled in China at this point. China is the leading trading nation and so forth. These are not easily reversed, but the United States does have the potential to do this if it chooses to. Very difficult to do that, but it has other weapons.
I largely agree with Mark. I think, both sides have to be careful. I think China needs to be careful that it should not become overly confident. On the other hand, the United States should also make sure that it does not lose its confidence. Right now, I think you see the opposite. I think China is becoming overly confident, as if China is going to be number one very soon, if not yet. And the United States, feels so threatened by others, by China in particular, that it has lost its confidence. And also would argue that, yes, for both China and the United States, the biggest threat, the biggest challenge is really from within, not from outside. And we all know, for example, the United States here, we have, this growing wealth gap, especially as a result of COVID-19, gun violence, rising racism, dilapidated infrastructure, a lot of issues in the United States that need to be fixed. But we're not paying a lot of attention domestically. We're so much interested in what's going on outside, in launching wars. And I think somebody mentioned in the chat room, yes, the industrial military complex is very powerful. I think this industrial military complex, to some extent, has hijacked the Americans' economic, social agenda. Likewise, in China, yes, its GDP total size is growing, but per capita GDP is still very small. I think as of now, it's only about 1/5 of the US standard. So it has a long way to go before we talk about China overtaking the United States as the largest economy. And inside China, we all know there are a lot of issues, right? Corruption, environment, this wealth gap, regional gap, and political reforms, right? A lot of issues, human rights. I cannot imagine that these two countries will start a war against each other without fixing their own problems first. I think, as a saying goes, they need to clean their own house first.
You mentioned racism, and I'm thinking that one of the things we haven't mentioned is the new anti-Asian racism, especially anti-Chinese, but across the board, and likely to be expanded if, in fact, we see a wave of Afghan refugees coming our way as well. One of those issues that we need to get our own house in order as well. Well, thanks for the questions, Drew.
Yes, of course. And I want to make sure we have time to get to a Q&A because we do have questions rolling in already. But do either of you have any final words or any discussions that you want to have with each other before I give the floor to a couple of different people to ask some questions?
I think we should leave the time to our audience.
Perfect. Yeah. Sounds great. So to begin, Gustavo Alvarez, if you are on and you have a question to ask, please begin. And if I miss you, feel free to message me, and I'm just going to keep moving on until we have a couple of questions here that are already in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have to unmute them. Can you give the names again, Drew?
Gustavo Alvarez. Thanks, Cole.
All right, is it working right now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Yes, so well, first of all, I just want to thank you for this amazing recapitulation of history and relations in general and also in detail. And I just wanted to ask you to begin more of a kind of call to action question regarding maybe young graduates as myself, and also our mission to kind of begin and go back to this first period of history that Sue mentioned, and to make it relations a little bit better again. And I was wondering if you were a young graduate or a young self-driven and a way motivated student that wants to work a little bit on creating and try to tackle a sector or a specific research field, to maybe bringing both, not only the US and China, but maybe both blocks, the Western bloc and more the Eastern bloc, together. What topics would you address, and what topics maybe would you focus on to work in the next years?
Good questions. Well, I'll start with a few things that are on my mind. Partly they're things that interest me, but I think they're areas that that need a lot of work. But I'll also mention that doing research on China, which might be part of your question or not, research on China these days, or certain kinds of research, are extremely difficult. For example, I've been doing work on Chinese labor in China. I've been doing some research on Chinese minority policies. These are two sets of issues that were possible to research extensively up till recent years. And in the context of the US-China conflict, they're the kinds of issues that one cannot easily research on the ground. Even Chinese in Hong Kong and elsewhere, people who had been working in China on issues of this kind over many years, find very, very difficult. But let's turn that around and think about the kinds of issues that can be researched and are important to research. I think both of those are important sets of issues at the present time, because they are shaping China's future, and they're shaping the relationship between China and the world. But if one takes on issues of that kind, you have to be ready to do them in ways other than on the ground, working in China, working with interviews, working up front, and you have to be ready to do library research at a distance. There are other kinds of issues that one still can do in China, but even they are very difficult. We don't know, for example, whether the American university programs in China are going to be able to continue in the next couple of years. I understand that some are already closing down, and others are facing pressures. For me, it's interesting to think about the big picture issues. How do we locate China in a global perspective at this time? And that means including, for sure, both the geostrategic and the political economy relationship with the United States. But we've also had on the table the fact that China is deeply involved with other countries, and its trade and investment relationships are worldwide. China has the most ambitious international aid program, another subject we haven't mentioned, but which I also think is a very good one for thinking about where China is going, what China's relationship with other countries will be, and other countries' relationship with China. It's an aid program which also has troubling features to it, as well as prospects for China playing a leadership role. And the final issue I want to mention that I think is crucial for many of us at this point is the environment. China and the US are the two greatest polluters in the world, and environmental issues are going to determine the future of your generation and future generations in crucial ways. And unless we are able to take these up as global problems and deal with the ever worsening environmental issues that are before us, we're in very deep trouble. Both nations have heavy responsibilities to do better in this, and all countries have heavy responsibilities.
Yes, I definitely agree. The climate change is the biggest challenge for both sides. I think that's where the two countries definitely can and should work together. And I'm glad to learn that President Biden's climate envoy John Kerry, which traveled to China again, second trip to China, sometime next month. He was in China earlier this year. So apparently the two sides are working together on climate change, despite all these disputes in all these areas. But obviously, there are many other areas that they can cooperate. North Korea, obviously. I think, we should be thankful to Kim Jong-un. He has not done anything recently. He has been very cooperative, but he can, he may shoot a missile anytime, without notice. But we should prevent that from happening. And definitely United States and China should work together to promote peace in East Asia. But Gustavo, you also mentioned what can young people do, right? What can on both sides, I guess, can do to promote this relationship. We all know, China, the Chinese students account for more than 1/3 of all international students, 370,000 plus, right? On the other hand, do we know how many American students are studying in China or are planning to study in China? I mean, this should be a two-way street, right? But that particular type of exchange is really lopsided, and it's not healthy. And also, if the United States really considers China as a threat, then shouldn't we spend more resources to learn about China and to study the language and culture, history, right? Why don't we do that? I've complained to our local school district, for example. You can continue to offer Spanish and French as foreign language, but add the Chinese as a foreign language. Do your best to educate our kids from a young age to learn something about China, for good or bad, right? We're not doing that. Do you know that actually many more American students go to any European country than they go to China? For every American students going to China, 3 or 4 of them will go to England, for example. And of course, many more will also go to France, Spain, right? So this is not right. I mean, you ask an average student, is China important? Oh yeah, China is very important. They know that. Do you want to go to China study Chinese? Well, right. The answer will be kind of disappointing, A lot of problems.
We just abolished the Fulbright program in China. That is the US premier program for sending people abroad. And I don't have the latest figures on students planning to go to China this fall, but I would be betting that the numbers are very, very small. And I haven't seen the figures on the Chinese coming this fall, but I'm assuming the numbers will be way down from previous levels.
Down a little bit, not too much actually. Yeah, about 15 or 18% drop, not too much. So you can, easily, after the COVID, easily to rebound, because there's so many Chinese students want to come here. Middle class Chinese love to send their kids, even at a young age, not just college, high school, even primary school, grade schools, they want to send their kids here. So we'll see a huge wave of Chinese students coming to this country, in the next few years, in the near future. But I don't see that the other way around. I don't see any increase. Actually, number of American students studying China has stagnated in the past 10 years or so. I follow some statistics from this Open Door, international education, this organization. The number has stagnated, no increase at all. It's really disappointing, and it is simply wrong, especially as the two powers are competing with each other. They got to know each other better. And education, cultural exchanges, these are fundamentals. We're not doing it, and the government here, the schools here are not encouraging it. And that's why I'm also very disappointed. Trump terminated the Fulbright program. This should be easily done, reversed by Biden. and he's not doing it. I'm totally disappointed.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all of you for having that conversation. I think it's an important one we need to have. And Gustavo, also as a young college student, I appreciate you asking those questions because I think it's something that's on a lot of our minds and should be something that's on. If it wasn't on the mind of a college student, we're hoping that those interested in making the world a more peaceful place understand that US and China are part of that process. So I appreciate that. Thank you. To begin with the next question, and I want to apologize in advance if I accidentally mispronounce some of these names as I bring you to the floor, but Renate Breidenthal, I believe you have your hand up and you had a question in the chat box as well.
Are you unmuted, Renata?
Renata, what is the name again? Renata?
Renata Breidenthal.
Thank you, Mark.
I can't see her in the list. Renata.
I can see the
Oh,
top.
there she is. There she is. Okay, I see her now. Okay. So you have to unmute, Renata.
Oh, I got it. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And Renata.
I had a whole bunch of choices for unmuting. It's not what I'm used to. Anyway, I'm sorry. My question goes to either or both of you, and it has to do more with current events. Like, what do each of you think about the way in which the current situation in Afghanistan will affect US-China relationships?
Well, let me get started, Mark. Okay,
Please.
A lot of people think that perhaps this is an opportunity for China to fill the vacuum. I don't think China is ready for that role. I don't think China is interested. It's a messy situation over there. I don't think China wants to clean up what the United States left behind. That's number one. Number two, I do think the two sides can cooperate in the post-war reconstruction of Afghanistan. We're not talking about the military approach. We're talking about the economic and social and educational assistance that the two sides can provide to a new Afghanistan, perhaps. So I think, yes, what we see now in Afghanistan is totally messy, right? It's even tragic even today, right? After the bombing, it's tragic. But there's a silver lining here, for the United States and China. Perhaps this offers an opportunity for them to cooperate, right? Because we're talking about how we can find new areas, as Gustavo also mentioned earlier. Can we find any new areas for cooperation? I would consider Afghanistan as a potential new area that the two sides can cooperate.
One thing that I like about talking with Professor Zhu is I really appreciate his optimism. And maybe it's youthful optimism. It seems to me that the current prospects for US-China cooperation on Afghanistan are slender. One of the things that's striking about the range of press reporting and the range of government statements is that after 20 years of laying waste that country and being defeated, we hear nothing about the kinds of proactive things that that Professor Zhu is rightly talking about that should be on our front agenda, having ended the military. It seems to me, however, that the only thing we hear about is rescuing Americans. We hear nothing about the impact that our war has had on the Afghanistan people. And the dialogue so far is the ways in which ending the Afghanistan war lets us get on to the big issue, which is how do we contest power with China, the things we've been talking about tonight already. So I don't see short run prospects for US-China cooperation on Afghanistan, and I don't see short run prospects for American cooperation with the post-war developments in Afghanistan. I think that the focus is going to be on bringing back Americans and bringing back those who cooperated with the United States against the Afghan people over those decades. And nothing that I'm hearing either in the press or coming out of the Biden administration leads me to see that in the cards. Now, the Chinese have a stake in this for sure. As you know, Afghanistan is on China's border. It's not a very big border. It's one of the smallest. So there's 17 countries that China borders. I think it's 17. Anyway, Afghanistan is one of them. And the Chinese have a particular interest in Afghanistan because of their own preoccupation with Afghan issues, with Xinjiang, with Uyghurs, and so there's a Chinese interest in seeing peace on its borders, and I expect that they will be trying to help in this, but I don't see it happening very likely anytime soon in cooperation with the US. I certainly hope that Professor Zhu is right about this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to pop right over to the next question just so we can get as many as possible during this time. So Michael Eisenschur, if you are still on and Cole can give you the ability to unmute yourself, feel free to ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I was wondering when you were talking earlier about when the shift took place in the relationship, what impact the global economic crisis of 2008 to about 2012 had on the US policy towards China in the one respect, and on China itself as a major trading nation. Did that play any role at all?
Yeah, well, so, earlier I think Drew asked, is there a starting year, when this relationship began to deteriorate? Actually, as I think back, if we have to pinpoint a year, actually 2008 would be the year, Why? Because as Michael mentioned in the question, that year, the global financial crisis started from here, but China was barely affected. And also remember, in that year, 2008, Beijing successfully hosted the Summer Olympics. So it was a sharp contrast. In other words, the United States was declining, was suffering here. But China was not affected by this global financial crisis and is charging ahead. So that got to be a turning point, I would argue. But just to get back to Michael's question, well, the global financial crisis obviously affected the United States. I mean, we all know that living here, right? Housing market, job market, the economy itself severely suffered, right? But again, China did pretty well during that period. I think China took advantage of the global financial crisis, and its economy continued to push ahead. And those years really were critical if you talk about this power transition between the United States and China. I think in this global financial crisis, 2008, 2012, really made a big difference here.
I think that's right. Let's put another crisis in the mix here. I'm thinking about the COVID crisis, where again, from what we know, and we may not know as much as we'd like to know, but from what we know, China came through this with powerful response to the crisis in Wuhan, and basically has controlled COVID far better than the United States, which for all our tremendous resources has been devastated by it. I'm in New York, which is perhaps the American capital of COVID disaster, and we are still facing another round, possibly with the latest variants when schools and everything else reopens in the fall. So one of the interesting themes that's emerging here is somehow China's uncanny ability to ride through crises and even take advantage of them in certain ways in a number of situations. On the other hand, if the conflict between the US and China moves to the military realm, then we have disaster that nobody is going to be immune to.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for talking a little bit more about kind of the origin or the most recent starting point of the deterioration between US and China and all the different factors that go into it. And let's see if we can, I know there are a lot of questions and I apologize because we are definitely not going to be able to get to all of them, but for the next question, Kesh Priyar from Nepal, if you, Cole, can give you the ability to unmute yourself. Let's try and get a couple more in here before the end of time. Kesh, I think you might have to unmute yourself. I do have your question right here and I can ask it as well. But let's, okay. So
Try to unmute once more.
I think you did it.
Well, but he's still muted.
yeah, unfortunately, he's still
How long did
muted.
it take?
Why don't you ask the question?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So Kesh's question is, could you guys talk a little bit more about the cooperative security promoting nuclear arms, strategic stability, and maritime security between the US and China? So please provide any insights and advice on how we can improve those relationships, peace, and security in the Indo-Pacific region.
Mark, you want to go first?
No.
Okay. Okay. So on this particular question, I'm very pessimistic. I don't think the United States and China can cooperate on maritime security or security in general in the Asia Pacific region. Why? Because that's the exact area they disagree with each other. That's the exact area they argue with each other. They may fight with each other. You know, in the South China Sea, especially over the Taiwan Strait. Just impossible because they have totally different views of the security situation in the Asia Pacific region. And they have different goals, they have different interests. There's no way they can cooperate. Only way I can think of is perhaps North Korea. No, they might be able to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's unfortunately so. And that kind of dialogue is extremely difficult to advance at this stage. And I think we have to look to forces within each country to encourage not so much dialogue with the other on that point, but being part of the international movement. For example, the latest treaty attempting to ban nuclear weapons. As we know, none of the nuclear powers joined that. And it's extremely difficult to think, even without the US-China clash, it's extremely difficult to see that reaching out to the nuclear powers. So we have to look to other kinds of areas in which we can find cooperation, including the nuclear area. It's not going to be US and China at this point.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. And final question for tonight, I'm going to hand over to Ann Wright.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a great symposium. Thank you. And my question is, you know, I've been a U.S. military officer, a colonel, 29 years in the Army, 16 years.
And don't limit yourself to your question either. You can say some things too.
Okay, and I am at a loss to figure out why the United States has this really aggressive military confrontation that at any moment there could be a mistake, an inadvertent whatever that could really lead us to a military conflict. And I live here in Honolulu, and this is the headquarters of the Indo-Pacific Command, and every day more and more threatening of China specifically as our enemy. And it just, the US normally picks on small countries, you know, that we can just slam. But China, a nuclear country with a large military, do you think that they really want to go to war with China?
Well, if we look at the policies that are emerging, it's reasonably clear that there are demands that China shift its policy direction on a number of fronts. They would prefer not to go to war with China, for sure. On the other hand, the policies are so in your face, as some of our discussion has suggested, so in your face under the extraordinary circumstances of having deep relationships between the two countries, even extending to the educational sphere, but economics, technology, and so on and so on. So in this respect, it's quite different from the Soviet-American Cold War, where there was relatively little economic and other relationships going. So it seems to me that, well, the power of your question is to recognize the myopia behind the assumption that these issues can be resolved by getting tough. And Hawaii is a perfect place to start thinking about this, of course, because this is the Indo-Pacific. We didn't talk about it enough today, but this is the attempt to rally Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, and the language of the group itself doesn't necessarily say to destroy China, but that's what this what the Indo-Pacific is about. It is about corralling China. So I'm glad you're incredulous, but we don't see an easy way around building discussion around issues of that kind at the moment. The discussion is, how do we build the Indo-Pacific? How do we corral China and force it to be reasonable our way at the present time?
Well, aloha, and right. I really think that the two countries will not, fight with each other. I mean, so we can ask a normative question. What will they fight for? For what? I mean, most likely area that will bring the two militaries into conflict will be Taiwan, right? But even on that, I mean, Pew and Gallup have done this kind of polls in the past. I haven't seen any recent polls, regarding, the question about whether U.S. military should, support Taiwan and go to war with China. In the past, majority said no, right? I mean, that's the only area really that the two countries are likely to fight with each other. So if you ask an average American, probably they don't even know where Taiwan is on the map. Why should the United States, send troops, our kids, sons and daughters, to a faraway land to fight with China, this giant country? Doesn't make sense. So I mean, from a realistic perspective, it's not going to happen. But hey, this country's policy, as I mentioned, is really heavily shaped by the industrial military complex. They control a lot of things, unfortunately. So they will hyper the China threat. And in Hawaii and elsewhere, they will conduct all these exercises to prepare for a contingency. But the bottom of their heart, you ask them, do you really think you're going to fight? You can ask the generals over there, you really ready to fight with China? I highly doubt. Doesn't make sense.
Clearly, the preference is not to fight a war with China. Clearly, the preference is to have our way by reasoning with them and pressuring them and forcing their hand. At the same time, Taiwan is the most significant flashpoint at this time. The United States in the last year to two has backtracked from the basic understanding of Taiwan as a part of China. The United States has greatly, substantially increased its military aid to Taiwan. This is the flashpoint in China-Taiwan relations on a scale that we haven't seen in quite a few years. And certainly it's not only that that Professor Zhu and I would like to see us not go to war with China over Taiwan or anything else. It's also that I don't think the Pentagon wants the war with China, but nor do I see signs of backing down at this point. And this is one of several areas in which the possibilities of accidents, so to speak, by two militaries that are at each other at sea, in the air, can lead to war. So I think the situation is quite dangerous, and we certainly hope it doesn't go that way.
Thank you, Anne, for asking that final question. I think that was a great way to wrap up what we've talked about today. And thank you everyone for staying on for a couple of minutes after, and I'm just going to give a brief closing. Thank you so much to both Mark and Zhiqun for their insight and conversations tonight. And thank you everyone who asked questions and participated as well. And I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question. And I just want to, again, thank tonight's sponsors. So they're up on the screen right now. Campaign for Peace, Disarmament and Common Security, Committee for a Sane US-China Policy, and Massachusetts Peace Action. Thank you for sponsoring tonight's webinar. Thank you again to both Zhiqun and Mark for being here, and everyone else for hanging on and listening to what we had to talk about today. I do want to let everyone know that there will be a recording of this sent out probably in the next few days, just so you can go back and listen to it if you have any interest in doing so. And I want to highlight one more event that Mass Peace Action is putting on in the coming weeks. And so we are going to have a couple of webinars about the lessons of Afghanistan, and it's going to be a two-part webinar series. And the first webinar is on Monday, August 30th at 7 p.m. and it will be about an hour long. And then the second one is on September 2nd, also at 7 p.m. And I think that these would both be of interest to everyone on this call. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a good night.
Thank you, Drew.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yes.
Drew.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.